Every parent's worst nightmare is seeing their child hungry and alone. For 60-year-old Eli Stoltzfus, that nightmare became reality when he found a starving girl collapsed outside his barn in 1934, Pennsylvania. She was no more than 12, her clothes torn rags, her face hollow from days without food. In his peaceful Amish valley, far from the chaos of the Great Depression, life had always moved at the same gentle pace. But this trembling child would change everything. When she looked up at him with desperate eyes, her words weren't what he expected. She didn't beg for charity or cry for help. Instead, she made him an offer that would break his heart. "I'm cheap and can work hard, mister." What secret would this desperate girl reveal that would force Eli to face the painful truth he'd been hiding from his community for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves as Eli Stoltzfus stood frozen beside his weathered barn door, staring down at the most heartbreaking sight he'd encountered in his 60 years of life. The child couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds. Her thin frame curled against the rough wooden planks like a wounded animal seeking shelter. Her dress, if it could still be called that, hung in tatters, patched and repatched with scraps of different fabrics, until it resembled a beggar's quilt more than clothing. But it was her eyes that stopped his breath. Ancient eyes in a child's face, the kind that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. They tracked his movements with the wariness of a cornered creature, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. "I'm cheap and can work hard, mister," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of desperate determination. "I don't eat much, and I can sleep anywhere. Just need a place to stay through winter." Eli's calloused hands trembled as he knelt beside her, careful to move slowly. In 40 years of living among the Amish, he'd learned that sudden movements could startle both wounded animals and damaged souls. The child flinched when his shadow fell across her, but she didn't run. "Child," he said in the gentle Pennsylvania Dutch accent that marked him as one of the plain people, "when did you last eat?" She considered this question with the seriousness of someone who had learned to measure time by hunger. "Tuesday, I think, maybe Monday. A lady gave me an apple core behind the market in Lancaster." Today was Friday. The Lancaster market was 23 miles from his farm. Eli's heart clenched as he calculated what this meant. A 12-year-old girl had walked over 20 miles in 4 days with nothing but apple scraps in her belly. The very thought made his own stomach turn with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "What's your name, little one?" "Grace," she said, then added quickly, "Grace Miller. I can milk cows and gather eggs and mend clothes. I learned from my mama before she—" The words caught in her throat, and she pressed her lips together as if refusing to let the pain escape. Eli understood that particular silence. He'd carried his own version of it for 23 years, ever since the fever took his wife Sarah and their infant daughter Rebecca in the span of a single devastating week. Some wounds were too deep for words, especially in a child so young. The Stoltzfus farm stretched across 97 acres of some of the most fertile land in Lancaster County, blessed with rich black soil that had sustained his family for 4 generations. The white farmhouse, built by his grandfather in 1847, stood solid and welcoming, with its wraparound porch and neat flower gardens. Behind it, the red barn dominated the landscape, its weathered sides testament to decades of honest labor and God's provision. This had been a place of joy once. Sarah's laughter had echoed from the kitchen windows as she tended her herb garden. Baby Rebecca's cries had filled the nursery upstairs, promising a future full of children's voices and Sunday dinners crowded with family. But fever had stolen those dreams, leaving Eli alone with his tools, his land, and memories too precious to share. Now he lived in careful solitude, finding purpose in his work as the community's master carpenter. His furniture graced nearly every Amish home in the valley, tables that would last generations, chairs that cradled growing families, cradles that welcomed new life. He crafted beauty for others, while his own house remained achingly quiet. The child, Grace, watched him with those two knowing eyes as he weighed his options. Taking in an outsider wasn't simply frowned upon in their community. It violated the careful boundaries that kept their world separate from the chaos beyond. Bishop Yoda and the other elders had spent decades protecting their people from outside influences that might corrupt their simple way of life. But looking at this broken child, Eli couldn't summon concern for community rules. All he could see was need meeting providence at his barn door. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. Grace struggled to her feet, swaying slightly but determined to prove her strength. Eli noticed she favored her left foot, probably walked too far on shoes that had long since given up their support. The soles were held to the uppers with twine and prayer. "Come," he said, extending his hand carefully. "Let's get some food in. You and then we'll see about a proper bed." She stared at his outstretched palm, as if it might be a trap. "What do you want in return?" The question pierced him. What kind of world taught a child to expect payment for basic kindness? "Nothing. Grace Miller, tonight I want nothing but to see you fed and warm." Something in his voice, perhaps the way he said her name like it mattered, seemed to break through her defenses. She placed her small, dirt-stained hand in his, and Eli felt the earth shift beneath his feet. He'd carried loneliness for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed, to have purpose beyond his daily routines of farming and carpentry. The kitchen hadn't seen this much activity since Sarah's death. Eli moved with unaccustomed energy, pulling out ingredients for a simple but filling meal: bean soup from yesterday's pot, fresh bread from the morning's baking, milk still warm from the evening milking. Grace sat at the oak table he'd built, with his own hands, her eyes following his every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned not to trust good fortune. "This is too much," she whispered when he set the bowl before her. "I can't pay for all this food." "Grace," Eli said, settling into the chair across from her. "In this house, food is a gift from God's provision, not something to be bought or earned. Now eat, child. Your body needs healing." She ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd known hunger intimately, savoring each spoonful while resisting the urge to rush. Eli pretended to read his Bible while watching her from the corner of his eye, noting how she used the bread to capture every drop of soup, how she drank the milk slowly to make it last. When she'd finished, her eyelids were heavy with the exhaustion that comes after the body's desperate needs are finally met. Eli led her upstairs to the small bedroom that had once been intended as a nursery. He'd kept it clean and ready. For what? He'd never been able to say. Now he understood. The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in one of Sarah's quilts, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the garden. Grace stood in the doorway as if afraid to enter such luxury. "This is for me?" she asked, her voice small with wonder. "For as long as you need it," Eli promised, though he had no idea what complications tomorrow might bring. She climbed into the bed, fully clothed, her body disappearing beneath the quilt's warm embrace. As Eli turned to leave, her voice stopped. "Him at the door. Mr. Stoltzfus?" "Yes, child. Thank you for not asking me to prove I'm worth keeping." Long after he'd blown out the lamp and settled into his own bed, Eli lay awake, thinking about those words. In the space of a single evening, this broken child had reminded him what it meant to open his heart to another's pain. Tomorrow would bring questions from neighbors, concerns from church leaders, and challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, his house didn't feel empty. In the small bedroom down the hall, Grace Miller slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had finally found safety. And in the master bedroom, Eli Stoltzfus stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of another person breathing in his home, wondering if this was how God answered prayers we didn't know we'd been praying. Outside, the Pennsylvania autumn wind whispered through the bare branches, carrying the promise of winter and change. Tomorrow would begin the test of whether one man's compassion could overcome a community's caution, whether love could grow in the space between hearts that had learned to protect themselves from further loss. The hand-carved wooden cradle in the attic, gathering dust for 23 years, seemed to stir with possibility. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of the night, Sarah's memory smiled down on the man who had finally found the courage to love again. Grace had been living in the Stoltzfus house for 3 days when she found the photograph. She hadn't meant to pry. Eli had asked her to dust the furniture in his bedroom while he worked in the barn, and she'd approached the task with the thoroughness of someone desperate to prove her worth. Every surface gleamed by the time she reached the tall dresser beside his bed. The top drawer had stuck when she'd tried to clean around it, warped wood catching on the frame. A gentle tug became a harder pull, and suddenly the drawer shot out, further than she'd intended, spilling its contents across the floor. Letters tied with ribbon, a small wooden cross, a woman's silver thimble, and beneath it all a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, a young woman holding an infant, both captured in the sepia tones of decades past. Grace knelt to gather the scattered memories, her heart racing with the panic of having invaded something sacred. But as she lifted the photograph, something in the woman's face made her pause. The eyes, kind and intelligent, seemed familiar somehow. The way she held the baby spoke of fierce love and infinite tenderness. "That's my Sarah." Grace spun toward the doorway, clutching the photograph to her chest. Eli stood there, his face a map of grief so raw and deep that she could feel her own eyes filling with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. The drawer stuck and everything fell, and I was just trying to clean." "It's all right, child." Eli entered the room slowly, as if walking through sacred ground. "Perhaps it's time those memories saw daylight again." He settled. Beside her on the floor, his weathered hands gentle as he took the photograph from her trembling fingers. For a long moment, he simply stared at the image, his thumb tracing the glass over the woman's face. "Sarah was the finest woman who ever drew breath," he said finally. "Married her when she was 19, and I was 22. Thought we had forever ahead of us." His voice caught, but he continued. "The baby is Rebecca, our daughter. She lived for 3 months before the fever took them both." Grace had seen grief before, in her mother's eyes when her father died in the factory accident, in her own reflection during the dark months that followed. But the pain radiating from Eli was different, aged and settled like wine left too long. "In the cellar, how long ago?" she asked softly. 23 years this November. 23 years of carrying this weight alone. 23 years of eating supper at a table set for one, of walking through rooms that had once echoed with laughter, of building cradles and high chairs for other people's children, while his own family's memory gathered dust in a drawer. "She was beautiful," Grace said, meaning it, "and the baby looks like she was perfect." Something broke open in Eli's face, not the clean break of sudden grief, but the slow, inevitable crumbling of walls too long maintained. Tears he'd held back for over 2 decades began to fall, and with them came words he'd never spoken aloud. "I failed them," he whispered. "Sarah was sick for days before I called the doctor. Thought it was just a cold, maybe something from the changing weather. By the time I rode to town for help, the fever had her in its grip. And Rebecca," his voice broke completely. "She was so small, so helpless. I held her while she struggled, for every breath, and I couldn't do anything to save her." Grace set aside the other scattered items and moved closer, her small hand finding his shoulder. She understood the weight of guilt that came with surviving when others didn't. She'd carried her own version since her parents' accident. If she'd been at the factory that day instead of home with a cold, maybe she could have warned them about the machinery malfunction that killed them both. "It wasn't your fault," she said, with the certainty of someone who'd needed to hear those words herself. "Sometimes terrible things just happen, and we can't stop them, no matter how much we love someone." Eli looked at her then, really looked, and saw not just the starving child he'd found at his barn door, but a fellow survivor of life's cruelest lessons. "How do you know such things at your age?" "Because I lost my mama and papa too." The words came easier than she'd expected, perhaps because his grief had created a safe space for her own. "Factory accident 2 years ago. Mama always said they were being extra careful, following all the rules. But the machinery broke anyway, and they were both—" She swallowed hard. "They were both crushed." Oh, child. Eli's tears were for her now, for all the pain packed into her small frame. "What happened to you after?" "Mama's brother took me in, but he didn't really want me. Said I was another mouth to feed in hard times. He tried to make me work for a family that wanted cheap help, but they were—" She shuddered, unable to voice the cruelties she'd endured. "So I ran away. Been walking ever since, looking for somewhere safe." They sat in the quiet afternoon light, two broken people sharing the weight of losses too heavy to carry alone. The photograph lay between them like a bridge spanning the years between past sorrow and present hope. "I dream about them sometimes," Grace whispered. "Mama and Papa. In my dreams, they're not hurt. They're just regular, like they used to be. And we're all together in our old kitchen making Sunday dinner." "I stopped dreaming about Sarah and Rebecca years ago," Eli admitted. "Thought it would hurt less if I kept them locked away, but now I wonder if I did them a disservice by hiding their memory." Grace studied the photograph again, memorizing the details of this family that had been stolen too soon. "Tell me about them. What were they like when they were alive?" And so Eli began to remember aloud. Sarah's laugh that could fill a room with joy, the way she hummed while working in her garden, how she'd insisted on naming their daughter Rebecca because it meant to bind, and she wanted their child to bind their family together with love. The games she'd played with the baby, the lullabies she'd sung, the dreams she'd whispered in the dark about watching their daughter grow up. As the afternoon faded into evening, Grace helped him put the scattered memories back in the drawer, but not before he'd shared each one. The silver thimble Sarah had used for her quilting, the letters he'd written to her during their brief courtship, the wooden cross he'd carved for Rebecca's cradle. "Will you keep the photograph out?" Grace asked as they prepared to go downstairs. "For supper?" Eli considered this, turning the frame over in his hands. "Yes," he said finally. "I think Sarah would like knowing someone else remembers her face." That night, as they sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread, the photograph watched over them from its new place on the windowsill. And for the first time since finding Grace at his barn door, Eli began to wonder if Providence had brought them together, for reasons deeper than either of them yet understood. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, reminding them that winter was coming fast. But inside the house of Levi, two lonely souls had found something precious in their shared sorrow, the beginnings of healing, and perhaps even hope. 3 weeks had passed since Grace Miller first collapsed at Eli's barn door, and the transformation was remarkable to behold. The hollow-cheeked waif had filled out under Sarah's old dresses, carefully altered by Martha Byler, the community's finest seamstress and Eli's nearest neighbor. Color had returned to Grace's cheeks, and her eyes no longer carried the desperate wariness of the hunted, but it was her eager determination to master every aspect of Amish life that truly amazed him. "Slower with the plane, child," Eli instructed, gently, as Grace struggled with the wood-shaving tool in his workshop. "Let the blade do the work. Fighting it will only tire you out." Grace adjusted her grip, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she guided the plane along the oak board. This time, a perfect curl of wood peeled away, leaving a smooth surface behind. "There," Eli nodded approvingly. You're learning to work with the wood instead of against it. That's the secret to good carpentry, understanding that everything has its grain, its natural way of being shaped. Is that why you're so patient with me? Grace asked, pausing to brush sawdust from her apron. Because you understand my grain? The question caught him off guard with its insight. Perhaps so, he admitted. You've got good instincts, Grace. Your hands know how to be gentle even when you're determined to work hard. They were crafting a small stool together, her first real woodworking project. Grace had insisted she needed something useful to contribute to the household, not just another mouth to feed. Eli had chosen the stool because it would test multiple skills, measuring, sawing, sanding, joining, without being so complex as to frustrate a beginner. Martha Byler is coming for supper tonight, he mentioned as Grace began sanding the legs they'd cut yesterday. She's been asking about your progress with the women's work. Grace's face brightened. Martha had become her advocate and teacher in the intricate world of Amish domestic arts. Under Martha's patient guidance, Grace was learning to cook traditional dishes, tend a kitchen garden, preserve food for winter, and master the complex art of quilting. I finished my first quilt square last night, Grace said proudly. Martha says my stitches are getting smaller and more even. Look, she pulled a small square of fabric from her apron pocket, carefully unfolding it to reveal a simple but lovely pattern in blues and whites. The stitching was indeed improving, though Eli could see the places where her inexperienced hands had struggled with the tiny, precise work. Sarah would have admired your determination, he said, running his fingers over the neat edges. She always said quilting taught patience and planning, seeing how small pieces could become something beautiful when brought together with care. Martha tells me stories while we work, Grace said, tucking the square away safely. About the families in the community, the traditions, what it means to live plain. She says you've been here longer than almost anyone, but you never talk much about yourself. Eli paused in his own work, considering how to respond. Martha Byler had sharp eyes and a sharper memory. She'd been one of the few community members who'd welcomed Sarah warmly when Eli brought his young bride home, and she'd been among the mourners who'd helped him bury his family. If anyone suspected there was more to his story than he typically shared, it would be Martha. Some stories are better told in their own time, he said finally. What matters now is learning what you need to know to find your place here. But this is my place, isn't it? Grace's voice carried a note of uncertainty that made his heart ache. I mean, you said I could stay as long as I needed, but you don't mean forever, do you? Forever. The word hung in the air between them like a promise, too dangerous to speak aloud. Forever meant making official what had grown naturally between them, the bond of chosen family, the love that had bloomed from shared meals and quiet conversations and small acts of daily care. Grace, he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the depth of what he'd come to feel for this brave, damaged child who'd wandered into his life like an answer to prayers he hadn't known he was praying. I know I'm not really your daughter, she said quickly, misreading his hesitation, and I know taking in an English girl makes problems for you with the church leaders. I hear the whispers when we go to town, see how some people look at me like I don't belong. Child, but I love it here, she rushed on, her words tumbling over each other in their urgency to be heard. I love learning from you and Martha, love the way everyone works together and takes care of each other. I love the quiet mornings and the way the light looks different here than anywhere else I've been. I love... She stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing. What do you love? Eli asked gently. I love having a father again, she whispered, even if it's just pretend. The workshop fell silent except for the sound of wind through the bare November trees outside. Eli set down his tools and turned to face Grace fully, seeing in her earnest, young face all the hope and fear of someone who'd learned not to count on good things lasting. Grace Miller, he said solemnly, there is nothing pretend about what we've built here. You are not a burden or a charity case or a temporary inconvenience. You are—" He paused, searching for words adequate to the magnitude of what he felt. "You are the daughter of my heart, chosen and cherished and wanted. If you'll have me, I would be honored to call myself your father in truth, as well as feeling." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she launched herself into his arms, nearly knocking him off his workbench. He held her tightly, this precious child who'd brought such unexpected joy into his quiet world, and felt Sarah's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder, blessing what had grown between them. "Does this mean I can stay forever?" Grace asked against his shoulder. "It means," Eli said, his own voice thick with emotion, "that you have found your home." That evening, Martha Byler arrived for supper with her usual combination of practical wisdom and gentle curiosity. She admired Grace's quilt square, praised the stool taking shape in the workshop, and shared the community news with the casual intimacy of someone who'd known Eli for decades. But as they cleared the dishes, Martha caught his eye with a meaningful look. "Walk with me to the porch," she suggested. "The evening air is mild for November." Once outside, she settled into one of the rocking chairs Eli had built for the wide front porch and studied him with the patient gaze of someone who understood the weight of unspoken things. "She's a good child," Martha said finally, "eager to learn, respectful, hard-working. The women who've met her speak well of her character." "But," Eli prompted, sensing the word hanging in the air between them, "but Bishop Yoda has been asking questions about her family, her background, her future here. There are concerns about taking in an outsider without proper consultation with the church leadership." Eli felt his shoulders tense. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind," Martha said gently, "that come when an unmarried man suddenly appears with a child no one knows anything about. People wonder about her story, Eli. They wonder about yours too." By late November, Grace had found her rhythm in the Stoltzfus household, with the natural ease of someone finally home. She rose before dawn to help with milking, tended the kitchen garden's winter preparations, and spent her afternoons in Eli's workshop learning the careful art of joining wood with wood. Her evenings belonged to Martha Byler, who arrived twice weekly with her sewing basket and infinite patience. But it was the quiet moments that revealed how deeply she'd woven herself into the fabric of Eli's life. The way she hummed while working, unconsciously echoing melodies Sarah had loved. How she remembered his preference for coffee over tea, his habit of reading scripture before bed, his tendency to favor his right shoulder when the old injury from a barn-raising accident flared up. "Read about Ruth again," Grace requested one December evening as they settled by the fire after supper. She'd claimed the rocking chair that had once been Sarah's, and Eli had discovered he loved seeing it occupied again. "You heard that story. Just 3 nights ago," he pointed out, though he was already reaching for his leather-bound Bible. The same one his grandfather had carried from Germany, its pages soft with age and handling. "I know, but I like how it ends. Ruth finding a new family, Naomi getting her joy back, everybody belonging somewhere." Grace pulled Sarah's quilt higher around her shoulders. "Read it the way you did before, with the voices different for each person." Eli smiled as he turned to the familiar passage. Grace had discovered his talent for bringing biblical characters to life through vocal changes, a skill he'd developed during the long evenings when Sarah was pregnant, reading aloud to entertain his expectant wife. And Ruth said, "Entreat me, not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee," he began, giving Ruth's words the gentle determination that matched Grace's own character. "For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Grace mouthed along with the familiar words, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd found her own version of Ruth's promise fulfilled. But their peaceful evening was interrupted by the sound of a buggy approaching the house. Eli set down the Bible, frowning. Visitors after dark were unusual in their community, reserved for emergencies or matters of serious concern. Through the window, he could see the distinctive black buggy of Bishop Yoda, its occupant climbing down with the deliberate movements of someone bearing unwelcome news. "Go upstairs, Grace," Eli said quietly. "Take the Bible with you if you'd like to finish the story." "Is something wrong?" Her voice carried the quick anxiety of someone who'd learned to fear sudden changes. "Nothing you need to worry about, child. Just church business." But Grace had lived through enough upheaval to recognize the signs. She gathered the quilt around her and headed for the stairs, though Eli noticed she stopped just out of sight on the landing, close enough to hear if her future was being discussed. Bishop Yoda entered without his usual pleasantries, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. At 72, he carried the authority of someone who'd guided their community through decades of challenge and change. He'd baptized Eli, married him to Sarah, and helped bury his young family. His presence in the evening shadows felt ominous. "Eli," he began without preamble, "we need to talk about the girl." "Grace is settling in well," Eli replied carefully. "Martha speaks highly of her progress with the women's work." "That's not what concerns me." Bishop Yoda settled into the chair Grace had vacated, his eyes taking in the domestic details that spoke of a household shared. 2 coffee cups on the side table, knitting left in Sarah's old basket, the Bible still warm from reading aloud. "What concerns me is the questions coming from the county authorities." Eli felt his blood chill. "What questions?" "About a missing child named Grace Miller, about why a man in our community has taken in an outsider without proper legal procedures, about whether the child is safe or properly cared for." The bishop's voice carried the weight of someone delivering unavoidable truths. "Someone reported your situation to the county office. They want to investigate. Grace is perfectly safe here. She's thriving. I know that, and you know that. But the English authorities see an unmarried man harboring a runaway child with no official permission or documentation. They're required to investigate such reports." Eli sank into his chair, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. Who would report such a thing? Does it matter? What matters is that you need to be prepared for questions you may not want to answer. About Grace's background, about your own history, about your intentions regarding her future. The fire crackled in the sudden silence, throwing shifting shadows across the familiar room that had become Grace's sanctuary. Upstairs, Eli could hear the soft creak of floorboards that meant she was listening to every word. "What do you recommend?" he asked finally. "The truth, as much as you're able to share." "But Eli..." The bishop leaned forward, his voice dropping to the tone reserved for confession and counsel. "There are things about your past that the community has never questioned. We accepted your conversion, your marriage to Sarah, your commitment to our way of life. But if officials start digging into records, asking about documentation, I understand." Eli's past was more complicated than most of his neighbors knew. His conversion to the Amish faith hadn't been a simple matter of religious calling. There were reasons he'd sought refuge in their community, reasons that seemed distant and harmless after 35 years of peaceful living, but which might appear different under official scrutiny. "The girl means something to you, Bishop," Yoda observed, his sharp eyes noting the way Eli's hands clenched when discussing Grace's potential removal. "She's brought light back into this house, purpose, joy I thought I'd never feel again. And if keeping her means exposing yourself to questions you'd rather not answer..." Eli thought of Grace upstairs, probably pressed against the landing wall, listening to her world being dissected by adults who held her fate in their hands. He thought of her eager face in the workshop, her determination to master every skill that would make her belong. He thought of the quilt square in her apron pocket, and the way she'd said she loved having a father again. "Then I'll answer whatever questions they ask," he said firmly. "Grace deserves a home where she's wanted and loved. If protecting that means facing my past, so be it." Bishop Yoda studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that, but Eli, you should know. The person who reported your situation mentioned something else. They claimed to be Grace's uncle, said he had legal custody rights and wanted her returned." The words hit like a physical blow. Grace had mentioned her uncle, The man who'd tried to sell her labor to families who'd treated her cruelly. The man she'd run from in desperation. "Over my dead body," Eli said quietly, but with such conviction that the bishop sat back in his chair. "That may be exactly what it takes," Bishop Yoda warned. "Are you prepared for that fight?" Upstairs, a floorboard creaked again, and both men looked toward the sound. Somewhere above them, a 12-year-old girl was learning that safety might be temporary, that love might not be enough, and that the past had a way of reaching into the present when you least expected it. The morning after Bishop Yoda's visit dawned grey and cold, with the kind of December wind that cut through wool coats and settled deep in the bones. Grace came down to the kitchen earlier than usual, her face pale but determined, and began preparing breakfast with mechanical precision. "You heard," Eli said gently. "It wasn't a question. Most of it." Grace cracked eggs into the skillet with steady hands, though he could see the slight tremor in her shoulders. "Are you going to send me away?" "Never." The word came out with such fierce certainty that Grace finally looked at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt or reservation. "Grace Miller, if they want to take you from this house, they'll have to drag me out first." Something in his voice, perhaps the way he said her name like a vow, seemed to ease the tight line of her shoulders. She nodded once, then returned to the eggs. But as they ate breakfast in companionable silence, Eli could see her mind working through possibilities and problems with the careful calculation of someone who'd learned early to plan for the worst. "Tell me about your uncle," he said finally. "His full name, where he lives, what kind of man he is." Grace set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap, a gesture he'd noticed she made when preparing to discuss painful subjects. "Harold Miller? He's Papa's younger brother, lives in a boarding house in Philadelphia. Works sometimes at the docks when there's hiring, drinks most nights at McSorley's Tavern." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white. "He took me in after. Mama and Papa died, but he made it clear I was a burden. Said I ate too much, cost too much, needed too many things. Did he hurt you?" "Not with his fists, if that's what you mean. But he had other ways." Grace's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He'd lock me in the cellar when I did something wrong. Leave me there for hours with no lamp, no food, just the rats and the dark. And when the Brennan family offered to take me as help for their boarding house, he made the arrangement without asking what I wanted." Eli's jaw tightened. "What happened at the Brennans?" "They wanted a servant, not family. Made me sleep in the kitchen, work from before sunrise to after midnight. Mrs. Brennan liked to remind me I was charity, that I should be grateful for scraps and a roof." Grace picked up her fork again, using the motion to steady herself. "But it was Mr. Brennan." "Who?" She stopped, shaking her head. "I can't talk about that part yet." "You don't have to, child, but if this uncle tries to claim you again, these details might matter. Can you be brave enough to tell the truth if it means staying here?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. "I'll tell. Anyone who asks exactly what kind of man Harold Miller is and exactly why I ran away." That afternoon brought Martha Byler with news that spread through the community faster than smoke. She arrived with her usual basket of sewing supplies, but her face carried the gravity of someone bearing difficult intelligence. "The county authorities were at the Fisher's place this morning," she reported as she and Grace settled into their quilting work. "Asking questions about you, about Eli, about how the community handles outsiders." Grace's needle paused mid-stitch. "What did they say?" "Anna Fisher told them you were a good child, well cared for and happy, but they wanted to know about legal guardianship, about whether proper procedures had been followed." Martha's experienced hands never slowed in their precise stitching. "They'll be here tomorrow, Grace. You and Eli both should be prepared." "What should I say?" "The truth," Martha advised. "But remember, child, the truth can be told different ways. You can speak of Uncle Harold's failures without dwelling on details that might upset you. You can describe your life here without having to justify why you deserve love and safety." That evening, as Grace worked on her quilting and Eli carved wooden toys for the community's Christmas gift exchange, she surprised him with a question that revealed how much she'd been thinking. "When you married Miss Sarah, did the community accept her right away?" Eli looked up from the small wooden horse he was shaping. "Why do you ask?" "Martha mentioned once that Miss Sarah wasn't born Amish, that she came from outside, like me." "That's true. Sarah grew up in a Methodist family in Lancaster. We met when I was doing carpentry work at her father's mercantile." Eli smiled at the memory. She was stubborn and curious and asked more questions about our way of life than most people. "Think of in a lifetime. Did people think she didn't belong? Some did at first. There were whispers about whether an outsider could truly commit to our ways, whether she was joining the community for the right reasons." Eli set down his carving tools and gave Grace his full attention. But Sarah proved herself through her actions, her faithfulness, her genuine love for our simple life. Eventually, even the doubters came to see her as one of us. Grace nodded thoughtfully, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out something small and tarnished, a silver locket on a thin chain. "I never showed you this," she said quietly. "It was Mama's, and her Mama's before that. It's the only thing I have left of my real family." She opened the locket with careful fingers, revealing a tiny photograph inside, a young couple standing proudly together, the woman's face bearing a strong resemblance to Grace's own features. "These are my parents," Grace said simply, "Thomas and Mary Miller. Papa worked at Henderson's textile mill, and Mama took in sewing to help make ends meet. They weren't rich or important, but they loved me more than anything in the world." Eli studied the photograph, noting the determined set of the man's jaw, the gentle intelligence in the woman's eyes. "They look like good people, Grace. I'm sorry. You lost them so young. I want the county people to see this tomorrow," Grace said, closing the locket carefully. "I want them to know I'm not just some runaway nobody. I had a real family once, people who loved me and wanted me to have a good life. And now I have that again, here with you, Grace. I know what Uncle Harold will tell them. He'll say I'm ungrateful, disobedient, more trouble than I'm worth. He'll make it sound like he was trying to help me and I threw it back in his face." Her voice carried the steady resolve of someone who'd thought through every angle. "But I have proof of who I really am, and I have people here who know what I've become. That has to count for something." Later that night, as Grace prepared for bed, she paused at Eli's bedroom door, where Sarah's photograph now held a place of honor on the dresser. "Do you think Miss Sarah would approve of me?" she asked softly. Eli looked at this brave, thoughtful child who'd brought such unexpected joy into his life, and felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "Grace," he said with absolute certainty, "Sarah would have loved you like her own daughter. She'd be proud of the young woman you're becoming and grateful that you brought light back into this house." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all day. "Then tomorrow, when they come with their questions, I'll remember that I'm not just Grace Miller the runaway. I'm Grace Miller the daughter, and I belong somewhere." Outside, the December wind howled around the farmhouse, carrying the scent of coming snow. But inside, two people who'd found family in each other prepared to fight for the right to keep what they'd built together. The county officials arrived precisely at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, their black automobile a stark intrusion in the peaceful farmyard where chickens scratched and horses grazed. Grace watched from the kitchen window as two men in dark suits climbed out, their faces set with the professional neutrality of people accustomed to investigating difficult situations. Eli had dressed in his best Sunday clothes, his beard neatly trimmed and his manner calm, despite the tension Grace could see in the set of his shoulders. He met the men at the porch steps with quiet dignity, shaking hands and inviting them inside with the courtesy their community showed all visitors. "Welcome." "Or not." "Mr. Stoltzfus," the older official began, settling into the parlor chair Eli indicated. "I'm Mr. Davidson from the County Welfare Office, and this is Mr. Patterson, who handles legal matters concerning minors. We're here about the child you've taken in, Grace Miller. Grace is in the kitchen preparing refreshments, Eli replied evenly. She'll join us shortly. But first, gentlemen, I want to be clear about something. Grace isn't some stray I picked up on a whim. She's a child who found her way to my door in desperate need, and I've given her the home and family she deserves. Mr. Davidson consulted his notes. According to our information, Miss Miller has a legal guardian, her uncle, Harold Miller of Philadelphia. He's expressed concerns about her welfare and wants her returned to his custody. Grace chose that moment to enter the parlor, carrying a tray of coffee and Martha's fresh-baked cookies with the poise she'd learned from watching Sarah's photograph and imagining what kind of woman would have graced this house. She'd braided her hair neatly and worn her best dress, the blue one Martha had sewn from fabric Eli had bought specially for her. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said politely, setting the tray on the side table. "I'm Grace Miller." Both officials studied her with the practiced eyes of people trained to assess a child's condition. They saw a healthy, well-groomed girl with clear eyes and steady hands, wearing clothes that were simple but clean and well-fitted. Nothing in her appearance suggested neglect or mistreatment. "Grace," Mr. Patterson said gently, "we need to ask you some questions about your living situation here and about your Uncle Harold. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, sir." Grace settled into the chair beside Eli, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. "I have some things I'd like to tell you, too." "Let's start with how you came to be here," Mr. Davidson suggested, his pen poised over his notepad. Grace told her story with the clear, steady voice of someone who'd rehearsed the truth until she could speak it without breaking. She described her parents' death, her uncle's reluctant guardianship, the arrangement with the Brennan family that had turned her into an unpaid servant. When she reached the part about Mr. Brennan's inappropriate behavior, she faltered only, slightly before pressing on with quiet courage. "That's when I ran away," she concluded. "I walked for 4 days before I collapsed at Mr. Stoltzfus's barn door. I was starving and desperate and scared, but I wasn't going back to that house. I'd rather have died first." Mr. Patterson had stopped writing, his expression troubled. "Grace, these are serious allegations about the Brennan family. Why didn't you report this to authorities? Who would have believed me?" Grace asked, with the bitter wisdom of someone who'd learned early that children's voices often went unheard. A 12-year-old girl with no family, no money, no proof, except her word against respectable adults. Uncle Harold made it clear I should be grateful for any roof over my head. He would have just moved me somewhere else and told them I was a troublemaker. "But you felt safe coming here?" Mr. Davidson asked. Grace's face softened as she looked at Eli. "Mr. Stoltzfus found me at my lowest point and asked for nothing in return except that I let him help. He fed me, gave me clean clothes, taught me skills I could be proud of. He reads to me from the Bible and helps me with my letters and treats. Me like," her voice caught slightly, "like I matter, like I'm worth caring about." The officials spent the next hour asking detailed questions about Grace's daily routine, her education, her integration into the community. They spoke with Martha Baylor, who arrived as if by chance, and provided glowing testimony about Grace's character and progress. They examined the room where she slept, the clothes in her dresser, the evidence of a child who was not just housed but cherished. When they asked to speak with Grace privately, Eli stepped onto the porch without protest, though Grace could see the difficulty it cost him to leave her alone with strangers who held such power over their future. "Grace," Mr. Patterson said once they were alone, "we need to ask you directly. Do you want to return to your uncle's custody?" "No." The word came out with absolute certainty. "Uncle Harold never wanted me in the first place. He only kept me because Mama made him promise to look after me if something happened to her and Papa. And now that the county is asking questions, he probably figures he can get rid of me officially and not feel guilty about it anymore." "What if we could find you a different placement? A family in town, closer to proper schooling and medical care?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. When she spoke, her voice carried a maturity that belied her 12 years. "Gentlemen, I've lived in 3 different places since my parents died. With Uncle Harold, I was a burden he resented. With the Brennans, I was free labor they could abuse. But here, with Mr. Stoltzfus, I'm a daughter. I have someone who wants to teach me things, who listens when I talk, who makes plans for my future because he believes I have one worth planning for." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the silver locket, opening it to reveal her parents' photograph. "These are my real parents, Thomas and Mary Miller. They loved me and wanted me to have a good life. Mr. Stoltzfus is helping me honor their memory by becoming the kind of person they'd be proud of. If you take me away from here, you're not rescuing me. You're destroying the only real family I've found since they died." When Eli was called back inside, Mr. Davidson's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching. "Respect, Mr. Stoltzfus," he said. "It's clear that Grace has thrived under your care. However, there are legal complications we need to address. Her uncle does have custody rights, and there are questions about proper procedures for guardianship."
"Transfer."
"What do you recommend?" Eli asked. "File for formal adoption through the county courts. It will require documentation, character references, home inspections, and legal fees. But if you're serious about making Grace your permanent daughter, that's the path forward." After the officials left, Grace and Eli sat in the quiet parlor, processing what they'd learned. The road ahead would be complicated and expensive, with no guarantee of success. But for the first time since Bishop Yoda's warning, they had a clear plan and official encouragement to pursue it. "Are you sure about this?" Eli asked. "Legal adoption means paperwork, court appearances, having our lives examined by strangers." Grace reached over and took his weathered hand in her small one. "Papa Eli," she said, using the name that had grown naturally between them. "You saved my life when you found me at your barn door. Now let me save yours by letting you love me officially." Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the farmyard in pristine white. Inside the Stoltzfus house, a man and a girl began planning their fight for the legal right to be family. The legal papers arrived on a grey January morning, delivered by the same county officials who'd visited before Christmas. But this time, their faces carried news that would change everything Grace and Eli thought they understood about their situation. "Mr. Stoltzfus, Grace," Mr. Davidson began as they settled in the familiar parlor. "We've been investigating Grace's background more thoroughly as part of the adoption process. We needed to verify her birth records, her parents' documentation, and her family history." Grace felt Eli tense beside her. They'd expected bureaucratic complications, but something in Mr. Davidson's tone suggested more significant discoveries. "What we found," Mr. Patterson continued, opening a manila folder thick with official documents, "changes the legal landscape considerably." He pulled out a yellowed birth certificate, its edges worn, but the text still clearly legible. "Grace Miller, born October 15, 1922, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Parents Thomas Miller and Mary Elizabeth Byler Miller." Grace frowned. "Byler? But that's Martha's family name," Eli finished quietly. "One of the oldest Amish families in the county." Mr. Davidson nodded. "We contacted the Byler family genealogy records maintained by your church community. Mary Elizabeth Byler was Martha Byler's cousin. More specifically, she was the daughter of Martha's uncle Jacob Byler, who left the Amish community in 1898 to work in Lancaster." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. That had counted time in the Stoltzfus house for 3 generations. Grace stared at the birth certificate as if it might rearrange its letters into something less earth-shaking. "That means," she said slowly, "Martha and I are related." "Second cousins," Mr. Patterson confirmed. "But there's more." He pulled out another document, a marriage certificate dated June 12, 1901. Sarah Elizabeth Byler married Eli Stoltzfus. Sarah Byler was Jacob Byler's sister, making her Mary's aunt. Grace felt the world tilt around her as the implications settled into place. Miss Sarah was my mama's aunt, which means, Eli said, his voice barely above a whisper, Sarah was your great aunt. You're not just an outsider, I took in Grace. You're family, blood family. The mathematics of relationship suddenly made terrible, wonderful sense. Sarah's brother Jacob had left the community, married outside the faith, and raised his daughter Mary in the English world. Mary had married Thomas Miller and given birth to Grace, who'd somehow found her way back to the very house where her great-aunt had lived and loved and died. This changes everything legally, Mr. Davidson explained. Blood relatives have preferential standing in custody matters, especially within established family structures. Your Uncle Harold Miller has no blood connection to you, Grace. He's related through marriage only, but Mr. Stoltzfus, as your great-aunt's widower, has a legitimate family claim. Grace looked at the photograph of Sarah and baby Rebecca, displayed now on the side table where she could see it daily. Sarah's eyes seemed to hold secrets she'd never imagined, the knowledge that somewhere in the wider world her brother's family was struggling, that a great niece might one day need the sanctuary of the house she'd made into a home. Did you? No, Grace asked Eli. When you found me, did you know who I was? No, child. I knew Sarah had family who'd left the community, but I'd lost track of them over the years. Jacob cut ties when he chose the English world, and Sarah rarely spoke of him after we married. Eli reached for Grace's hand, his eyes bright with wonder. But perhaps Sarah knew. Perhaps she guided your steps to this door. Martha Byler arrived within the hour, summoned by news that traveled through the Amish community with the speed of wind across wheat fields. Her face showed the same amazement Grace felt as she studied the birth certificate, with the careful attention of someone who'd memorized her family's history across generations. Mary Elizabeth, Martha said softly, Jacob's youngest daughter. I remember when she was born, such a pretty baby, with the biggest brown eyes, but Jacob moved his family to Lancaster when she was just 3 years old. We lost touch after that. Did you know she'd died? Grace asked. We heard about the factory accident, but we didn't know the details, didn't know about you. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at Grace with new understanding. Oh, child, you've been trying so hard to find your place here, and you belonged all along. The afternoon brought Bishop Yoder and 3 other church elders, drawn by news that transformed Grace from an outsider requiring special consideration to a member of their extended family who'd simply found her way home. The careful balance of community acceptance that Grace had been working toward for months shifted instantly into something deeper, the automatic inclusion that came with blood ties and shared history. This explains much, Bishop Yoder said, studying Grace's features with new eyes. You have the Bela, look around the eyes, the same way of tilting your head when you're thinking hard. I should have seen it before. Does this mean the county will approve the adoption? Grace asked. It means, Mr. Davidson said, that the adoption becomes a formality. Mr. Stoltzfus isn't taking in an unrelated child. He's providing a home for his deceased wife's great-niece. That's exactly the kind of family arrangement the courts are designed to support. That evening, as Grace helped prepare supper, she moved through the kitchen with the same efficiency she'd developed over the past months. But everything felt different now. The cast-iron pans that had belonged to Sarah, the blue dishes arranged in the cupboard, the view from the window over the garden where Sarah had grown her herbs and flowers. It's strange, she said, as she set the table for 2. This morning I was Grace Miller, the outsider you took pity on. Tonight I'm Grace Miller, the family member who found her way home. You were always family, Eli said firmly. Blood doesn't make family, Grace. Love does. What we discovered today just gives the law a way to recognize what our hearts already knew. But privately, Grace wondered at the mysterious workings of Providence that had guided her stumbling steps across 23 miles of Pennsylvania countryside to the one door where she would find not just shelter, but belonging. Had Sarah somehow, it called her home, had the love that had filled this house for 3 short years created a beacon that could reach across decades and draw lost family back to safety. That night, Grace knelt beside her bed, the bed that had been intended for Sarah and Eli's children, and opened the silver locket to look at her parents' faces. For the first time since their death, she felt connected not just to their memory, but to a larger story of family and faith that stretched back through generations. "Thank you," she whispered to Sarah's photograph across the hall, "for showing me the way home." In the master bedroom, Eli sat on the edge of his bed and held his own conversation with the past. 23 years ago, he'd lost his wife and daughter to fever, leaving him alone with grief and an empty house. Now, through the mysterious workings of love and providence, he'd gained not just a daughter to cherish, but the knowledge that Sarah's family line would continue through Grace's bright spirit and determined heart. The papers scattered across. His dresser told the legal story, birth certificates and marriage records and genealogy charts that proved what his heart had recognized from the first night Grace slept under his roof. But the real story was written in smaller details. Grace's laugh that echoed Sarah's joy, her stubborn determination that matched the Byler family's legendary persistence, her capacity for love that had somehow survived every loss and betrayal. Life had thrown at her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they navigated the formal adoption process. But tonight, Grace Miller slept peacefully in the room intended for her great-aunt's children, and Eli Stoltzfus marveled at the way God could weave together the broken threads of different lives into something beautiful and whole. Spring arrived early in Lancaster County that year, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings and the formal court date that would determine Grace's permanent future. The months following the revelation of her blood connection to the Stoltzfus family had passed in a blur of legal preparations, community support, and the deep satisfaction of watching Grace bloom fully into her role as daughter and community member. By May, she had mastered Martha's quilting techniques well enough to contribute a full square to the community's wedding ring quilt, a masterpiece that would serve as her formal gift to the church and symbol of her complete integration into their way of life. Her stitches were tiny and precise, her color choices showing an artist's eye for harmony and balance. The other women praised not just her skill, but the joy she brought to their weekly quilting circles. "You've got the gift," Martha declared, one Thursday afternoon as they worked together in the Stoltzfus parlor. "Not just for needlework, but for bringing people together. Look how much livelier our gatherings have become since you joined us." It was true. Grace had a talent for drawing out the quieter women, remembering personal details that made each person feel valued, and mediating the small tensions that inevitably arose when strong-willed people worked closely together. At 14, now, they'd celebrated her birthday with the first party the Stoltzfus house had seen in decades. She moved between the adult and children's worlds with the natural grace of someone who belonged completely in both. But it was her relationship with Jacob Fisher that had become the source of gentle community speculation and Eli's protective concern. At 19, Jacob had grown from the awkward boy who'd shown Grace early kindness into a young man of remarkable character and gentle strength. His interest in Grace was patient but unmistakable, approved by his family and watched with benevolent attention by the community elders. "She's too young for serious courtship," Eli had grumbled to Martha after Sunday service, where he'd noticed Jacob's lingering glances and Grace's shy smiles. "She's the same age Sarah was when you first noticed her," Martha reminded him with the frank honesty of old friendship. "And Jacob's a good boy from a good family. He'll wait until she's of proper age, and he'll treat her with respect." "That's what concerns me," Eli muttered. But his protests carried more ritual than real objection. He'd grown to respect Jacob's character and to see how the young man's attention brought out Grace's natural confidence and joy. The legal preparations had proceeded smoothly once Grace's family connections were established. Character witnesses lined up eagerly: Martha Byler, Bishop Yoder, the Fisher family, and a dozen other community members ready to testify about Grace's character and Eli's fitness as a father. The county officials had conducted their required home inspections with increasingly perfunctory attention, clearly convinced that Grace had found not just a good home, but the perfect one. Only one shadow remained to darken their optimism: Harold. Miller's continued insistence on his custody rights and his increasingly desperate legal maneuvers to maintain his claim on Grace. "He's hired a lawyer," Mr. Davidson informed them during his final pre-trial visit. "Someone from Philadelphia who specializes in custody disputes. They're arguing that blood relationships through deceased relatives don't override established legal guardianship, and that Grace should be returned to familiar urban environment rather than isolated rural community." Grace felt her stomach tighten. With familiar fear, but Eli's steady presence beside her provided the anchor she needed to face this latest challenge. "What are our chances?" Eli asked. "Excellent, given the circumstances." Grace's testimony about her treatment under her uncle's care, combined with the obvious success of her placement here, should carry significant weight. But custody hearings can be unpredictable, especially when one party is represented by aggressive counsel. That evening, as Grace worked on her quilting and Eli carved wooden animals for the community's summer market, she surprised him with a question that revealed how much she'd been worrying. "Papa Eli, what if the judge decides Uncle Harold was right? What if they think I belong in the city with my own kind instead of here with the plain people?" Eli set down his carving knife and gave Grace his full attention. In the lamplight, she looked every inch the young Amish woman she'd become. Her prayer covering neat over carefully braided hair, her dress simple but beautifully made, her hands skilled at the traditional crafts that connected her to generations of faithful women. "Grace," he said gently, "you are with your own kind. You're with people who love you, who share your blood, who've watched you grow into the fine young woman you're becoming. That's what makes a family, not geography or culture, but love and commitment and shared faith. But what if it's not enough? What if, child?" Eli moved to sit beside her, taking her restless hands in his calloused ones. "Do you remember the night you found Sarah's photograph? What you told me about guilt and surviving when others don't?" Grace nodded, remembering that conversation that had opened both their hearts to healing. "You told me that sometimes terrible things happen that we can't control, no matter how much we love someone. But you also showed me that love doesn't end with death. It continues in the people who remember, who honor that love by building something beautiful from the pieces left behind." He gestured around the room that had become Grace's true home: the quilting frame where she worked beside Martha, the bookshelf filled with volumes they read together in the evenings, the photographs that told the story of past and present love. Intertwined. "Whatever happens in that courtroom, Grace, you've already won. You've built a life here, earned the respect and affection of an entire community, discovered your place in a family story that stretches back generations. No judge's decision can take away what you've become or change the fact that you belong." Here, Grace leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady strength. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Eli said honestly. "But we're scared together, and we're not facing this alone." As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of approaching buggies, first one, then several more. Through the window, Grace could see lantern light bouncing through the darkness as their neighbors arrived unannounced for what could only be a gathering of support. Martha Byler led the procession, carrying a covered dish and wearing the determined expression of someone prepared for battle. Behind her came the Fisher family, Bishop Yoder and his wife, the Yoder's grown children, and a steady stream of community members until the Stoltzfus house overflowed with people who'd come to offer encouragement and practical help. "We heard about the court date," Martha announced as she bustled into the kitchen and began organizing the food offerings. "Thought you might like some company while we finish preparing." What followed was an evening unlike any in the house's long history. Adults shared stories of their own struggles with outside authorities, offering advice and reassurance. Children played games that filled the rooms with laughter. The women worked together to put finishing touches on Grace's wedding ring quilt, each adding a few stitches to the project that would serve as tangible proof of her complete integration into their community. Jacob Fisher approached Grace during a quiet moment, his young face serious with concern and affection. "Grace," he said softly, "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, it doesn't change anything between us. If you have to leave, though I pray you won't, I'll wait for you. However long it takes, wherever you go, I'll wait." The simple sincerity of his declaration brought tears to Grace's eyes. In Jacob's steady gaze, she saw not just romantic interest, but the kind of lifelong commitment that had sustained her adoptive community through generations of challenge and change. "Thank you," she whispered, understanding that he was offering her something precious, the promise that her future held not just the security of family, but the possibility of love and companionship with someone who truly understood her heart. As the evening wound down and neighbors prepared to return to their own homes, Bishop Yoder called for silence and offered a prayer that encompassed all their hopes and fears. "Heavenly Father," he began in the Pennsylvania Dutch that connected them to their ancestors, "we gather tonight as a community united in love for this child who found her way to our hearts. We ask for your wisdom to guide the earthly authorities who will decide her future, and for your peace to rest on all who love her, whatever tomorrow may bring." The collective amen that followed carried the weight of genuine faith and fierce protection. As the house emptied and Grace prepared for bed, she carried with her the knowledge that she wasn't just fighting for the right to stay with Eli. She was fighting to remain part of a community that had claimed her as completely as she had claimed them. That night, Eli sat beside Grace's bed as he had during her first frightened weeks in his house, reading aloud from the Bible, until her breathing grew deep and peaceful. The passage was Ruth's story again, the tale of loyalty, faith, and belonging that had become their own narrative. Tomorrow would bring the final test of whether love could triumph over law, whether chosen family could stand against bureaucratic challenges, whether a girl who'd started life as an outsider could officially become the daughter her heart had always known she was meant to be. The Lancaster County Courthouse bustled with morning activity as Grace and Eli arrived for the custody hearing that would determine their future as a family. Grace wore her finest dress, deep blue with careful stitching that demonstrated Martha's skill and her own growing expertise with needle and thread. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her collar, hung the small wooden cross Eli had carved for Rebecca's grave, now given to Grace as a tangible reminder that love transcends death and creates unbreakable bonds. Harold Miller stood near the courthouse steps, looking exactly as Grace remembered, thin and sharp-featured, with the restless energy of a man more comfortable in taverns than courtrooms. His lawyer, a well-dressed man with calculating eyes, spoke in urgent whispers, while Harold nodded and gestured toward Grace with possessive familiarity. "Remember," Eli said quietly as they climbed the courthouse steps, "tell the truth, simply and completely. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of the life we've built together." Inside the formal courtroom, Grace felt momentarily intimidated by the serious atmosphere. The raised judge's bench, the witness stand, the gallery filled with supporters and observers. But when she saw Martha Byler's encouraging smile and Jacob Fisher's steady presence in the front row, her courage solidified. Judge Margaret Harrison entered with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions about family matters. In her 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes, she carried herself with the authority of decades spent protecting children's interests. This hearing concerns the custody of Grace Miller, currently in the care of Eli Stoltzfus. Judge Harrison began. Mr. Thompson, you represent the petitioner Harold Miller? Harold's lawyer rose with theatrical confidence. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Miller is Grace's legal guardian, appointed after her parents' tragic death. He seeks the return of his niece, who was removed from his care without proper legal procedure. And Mr. Davidson represents the county's interests? Yes, Your Honor. The county supports Mr. Stoltzfus's petition for adoption, based on our investigation of Grace's circumstances and her expressed preferences. What followed was Harold Miller's attempt to paint himself as a caring guardian, whose well-intentioned arrangements had been misunderstood by an ungrateful child. His lawyer presented a carefully crafted narrative. Harold had secured Grace employment with a respectable family, providing both supervision and practical training. When Grace ran away, Harold had searched desperately, only to discover she'd been taken in by strangers without his knowledge or consent. My client has maintained steady employment at the Philadelphia docks, Mr. Thompson declared. He's prepared to provide proper urban education, exposure to modern opportunities, and supervision appropriate for a girl approaching marriageable age. Grace felt her stomach clench at the familiar mixture of manipulation and false concern in Harold's testimony. He spoke of her with the same proprietary tone he'd used when arranging her placement with the Brennan family, as if she were property to be managed rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. When called to testify, Harold presented himself as the responsible adult, making difficult decisions for Grace's own good. Yes, the Brennan arrangement hadn't worked out as hoped, but that didn't mean abandoning her to rural isolation was the solution. Grace is a city child, he testified, glancing at her with what was meant to pass for affection. She needs proper schooling, medical care, social opportunities. Living among these people limits her potential, cuts her off from the world she was born to inherit. The way he said "these people" made Grace's face burn with protective anger. He spoke of her Amish community with barely concealed disdain, as if their faith and traditions were quaint obstacles to overcome, rather than the foundation of her happiest, most secure months. Mr. Thompson's cross-examination focused on technicalities, the legal irregularities of Grace's informal placement, Eli's lack of official guardian status, the community's separation from mainstream society. He painted a picture of well-meaning but misguided people who'd overstepped their authority in taking responsibility for a child who wasn't theirs to claim. But when Grace was called to testify, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted noticeably. She walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, her hand briefly touching the wooden cross at her throat before she placed her palm on the Bible to swear her oath. "Grace," Judge Harrison said gently, "I want you to tell me, in your own words, what happened after your parents died and how you came to be living with Mr. Stoltzfus." Grace took a deep breath and began her story. She spoke of her uncle's reluctant guardianship, the boarding house that never felt like home, the arrangement with the Brennan family that had turned her into an unpaid servant subject to increasingly inappropriate demands. Her voice remained steady, even when describing her desperate flight and the 4 days of walking that had brought her to Eli's barn door. "When I collapsed outside Mr. Stoltzfus's barn, I wasn't thinking about legal procedures or proper channels," she said. "I was 12 years old, starving and terrified. All I could offer was my willingness to work hard in exchange for safety." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "And what did you find instead?" "I found a father," Grace said simply, her eyes finding Eli's across the courtroom. "Not someone who wanted to use my labor or manage my life, but someone who wanted to know who I was and help me become who I was meant to be." She described the months of patient teaching, the gradual discovery of her family connections, the community that had embraced her completely once they understood her blood ties to their history. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of Martha's quilting lessons, the carpentry skills Eli had shared, the sense of belonging that had healed wounds she hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Your Honor," Grace continued, "when Uncle Harold speaks of my potential and opportunities, he's talking about what he thinks I should want, not what actually makes me happy and whole. I've lived in the city and I've lived in the country. I've been treated as a burden, as free labor, and as a beloved daughter. I know the difference." Judge Harrison consulted her notes. "Grace, I understand you've recently learned about your family connections to Mr. Stoltzfus's late wife. Can you tell me how that discovery affected your feelings about your placement?" "It explained things," Grace said thoughtfully. "Why I felt at home so quickly, why the community traditions felt familiar even when they were new to me, why Mr. Stoltzfus and I understood each other from the beginning. But, Your Honor, the blood connection didn't create our family bond. It just gave us a way to explain what we already felt." When Mr. Thompson cross-examined Grace, trying to shake her testimony and suggest she'd been coached or coerced, her responses revealed the depth of her integration into her new life. She spoke knowledgeably about Amish customs, demonstrated her literacy improvements, and answered questions about her daily routine with the confidence of someone genuinely content with her circumstances. "Miss Miller," Mr. Thompson said with patronizing concern, "don't you think you're too young to make permanent decisions about your future? What if you change your mind about this lifestyle as you mature?" Grace considered this seriously. "Mr. Thompson, I've lived through enough different situations to understand what works for me and what doesn't. I'm not choosing the Amish way of life because I don't know anything else. I'm choosing it because I've experienced what it means to be valued, protected, and loved unconditionally." The afternoon brought character witnesses who painted a vivid picture of Grace's transformation and integration. Martha Byler testified about Grace's skill development and her natural gift for bringing people together. Bishop Yoder spoke of her respectful participation in church life and her genuine commitment to their faith traditions. Jacob Fisher's father described her helpfulness during community workdays and her growing reputation as someone who could be trusted with increasing responsibility. But it was Mr. Davidson's presentation of the community petition that created the courtroom's most powerful moment. Every adult member of their Amish district had signed a formal request for Grace's permanent custody to remain with Eli, along with their pledge to support her education, health care, and future welfare as a community responsibility. "Your Honor," Mr. Davidson said, holding up the document covered with careful signatures, "this represents something unprecedented in my experience. An entire community formally requesting the right to help raise a child. These people don't just approve of Grace's placement, they've committed themselves to her future." Harold Miller's testimony in his own defense revealed the cracks in his facade. Under questioning about his treatment of Grace, his motivations for seeking her return, and his specific plans for her care, his answers grew increasingly defensive and contradictory. "I did my best with limited resources," he insisted when pressed about the Brennan family arrangement. "A man in my position can't be expected to provide full-time supervision for a growing girl. I found her respectable employment." "Employment?" Judge Harrison interrupted. "Mr. Miller, Grace was 12 years old. Are you saying you arranged employment for a 12-year-old child?" She needed to learn responsibility, contribute to her upkeep. The Brennans were willing to provide room and board in exchange for domestic help. It's a common arrangement." "And when that arrangement ended badly, what was your plan for Grace's continued care?" Harold's hesitation spoke volumes. "I would have found something suitable. Another family, perhaps, or boarding school when she was older." Judge Harrison's expression grew noticeably cooler. "Mr. Miller, it appears your primary concern was finding someone else to assume responsibility for Grace's care rather than providing it yourself. The final moments of the hearing belonged to Eli, whose testimony carried the weight of genuine parental love and specific plans for Grace's future. He spoke of the legal adoption process, his financial ability to provide for her needs, his commitment to her education, and his hopes for her eventual marriage within their community. "Your Honor," he concluded, "Grace didn't just find shelter in my house, she brought it back to life. She's not a charity case or a burden I've accepted. She's the daughter I never expected to have, and I'm the father she chose. We're asking you to make legal what our hearts already know, that we belong together." Judge Harrison recessed for deliberation, leaving Grace and Eli to wait with their supporters in the courthouse hallway, knowing that the next hour would determine whether their chosen family could become their legal one. 2 years had passed since Judge Harrison's gavel fell with the decision that made Grace Miller legally and permanently Grace Stoltzfus. The spring of 1937 found her at 16, no longer the desperate child who'd collapsed at Eli's barn door, but a confident young woman whose place in the community was as established as the ancient oak trees that shaded the farmhouse. The transformation was evident in every aspect of her daily life. Her hands, once thin and desperate, now moved with the assured grace of someone who'd mastered both traditional women's work and the carpentry skills Eli continued to teach her. Her quilting had progressed to the point where other women sought. Her advice on complex patterns and her furniture finishing work was nearly indistinguishable from Eli's own craftsmanship. But it was her role as the community's unofficial coordinator of charitable efforts that truly demonstrated how completely she'd found her place. When families faced hardship, Grace seemed to know instinctively how to organize help without making the recipients feel diminished. When conflicts arose between neighbors, people increasingly turned to her for mediation, trusting her ability to see all sides and find common ground. "You've got your great-aunt's gift for bringing people together," Martha observed as they worked side by side in the Stoltzfus kitchen, preparing food for the Yoder family while their mother recovered from childbirth. Sarah had that same way of making everyone feel valued and heard. Grace smiled, thinking of the photograph that still graced Eli's dresser, Sarah holding baby Rebecca, both captured in a moment of perfect love. Sometimes Grace could almost feel Sarah's presence in the house, a gentle blessing on the life that had grown where tragedy had once reigned. The legal victory had been complete and unambiguous. Judge Harrison had granted Eli's adoption petition, terminated Harold Miller's custody rights, and issued a formal finding that Grace's placement represented the best interests of the child in every measurable way. Harold's lawyers' arguments about urban opportunities and mainstream education had crumbled in the face of Grace's obvious contentment and the community's unprecedented commitment to her welfare. The aftermath had been even more satisfying than the victory itself. Harold Miller, faced with legal fees he couldn't afford and the complete collapse of his custody claims, had disappeared back to Philadelphia and out of Grace's life permanently. The county officials had filed their reports with recommendations that other child welfare cases looked to the Stoltzfus adoption as a model of successful placement. But for Grace and Eli, the real celebration had come in the quiet moments that followed, the first time Grace signed her name as Grace Stoltzfus on church records, the morning Eli officially added her to his will as his sole heir, the Sunday when Bishop Yoder announced her upcoming baptism into the church as a full adult member. Now, as spring painted the Pennsylvania countryside in fresh greens and gentle pastels, Grace found herself preparing for another milestone that would complete her integration into the community she'd chosen. Jacob Fisher, now 21 and established as a master craftsman in his own right, had formally approached Eli with a request to court Grace with marriage in mind. The conversation had taken place in Eli's workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had become the foundation of Grace's education in patience, precision, and the satisfaction of creating something lasting with one's own hands. "I love her, Mr. Stoltzfus," Jacob had said with the straightforward honesty that characterized his approach to everything important. "I've loved her since she was that scared girl who helped during harvest, but now I love the woman she's become, strong and wise and kind. I want to build a life with her, raise children who'll know the same security and love she's found in your house." Eli had studied the young man carefully, seeing not just romantic interest, but the qualities that would make Jacob a worthy partner for his precious daughter. Stability, faith, gentleness, and the kind of quiet strength that would complement Grace's more outgoing nature. "And what does Grace say about your intentions?" Eli had asked. Jacob's smile had been answer enough. "She says she'd like to continue the conversation, but only with your blessing and the community's approval." That blessing had been given gladly. Along with Eli's promise to build the young couple a house on the eastern section of his property, close enough for daily contact, far enough for independence. The community's approval had followed naturally, with families already making plans for the wedding celebration that would mark Grace's final transition from rescued child to established adult. On this particular May evening, as Grace and Eli sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and golds, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd collapsed at someone else's door that night?" she asked, her hands busy with the mending that was never quite finished on a working farm. Eli rocked slowly in the chair he'd built 40 years earlier for Sarah's comfort during her pregnancy. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that some things are meant to be. You needed a father who could understand what it meant to lose everything and find hope again. I needed a daughter who could bring joy back to this house without trying to replace what was lost. And now we've both learned that love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies. Sarah and Rebecca will always be part of our family story, but there's room in our hearts for new chapters too." Grace nodded, understanding the profound truth he'd spoken. The love she shared with Eli hadn't erased his grief for his lost family. It had transformed that grief into something generative, a foundation for new love rather than a barrier against it. A boogie approached along the lane, and Grace smiled, recognizing Jacob Fisher's distinctive brown gelding. Their courtship proceeded with the gentle formality their community preferred. Supervised visits, group activities, conversations that deepened their understanding of each other's character and dreams. "Good evening, Mr. Stoltzfus, Grace," Jacob said as he climbed the porch steps, his hat in his hands, and his face bright with the happiness that seemed to radiate from him whenever Grace was near. "Jacob." Eli nodded approvingly. "Grace was just telling me about the plans for the summer market. Sounds like you two have been busy organizing the community's participation." "Grace has a gift for seeing how all the pieces fit together," Jacob said, settling onto the porch step with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. "She's convinced 3 more families to participate, and her ideas for displaying the quilts will show them to much better advantage." Grace felt the familiar warmth that came from being truly seen and appreciated. Jacob understood her mind as well as her heart, valued her ideas as much as her affection, and treated her as an equal partner in their shared plans for the future. As the evening deepened and fireflies began their ancient dance across the farmyard, the 3 of them talked about practical matters: the progress on Jacob and Grace's future house, the success of this year's crops, the upcoming baptism that would mark Grace's full membership in the church. But underneath the ordinary conversation ran the deeper current of profound contentment, the satisfaction of people who'd found their place in the world and with each other. When Jacob finally took his leave, with promises to return for Sunday, dinner and tentative plans for a picnic the following weekend, Grace and Eli sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds that had become the soundtrack of her new life. Crickets singing in the garden, horses moving quietly in the pasture, the distant call of owls hunting in the woodlot. "Papa," Grace said softly, using the name that had evolved naturally between them. "Do you think Mama and Papa Miller would approve of who I've become?" Eli considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. In the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window, he could see both the child who'd arrived at his door and the woman she'd grown to be, confident, compassionate, deeply rooted in faith and community, ready to build a family of her own while remaining forever connected to the one that had saved her. "Grace," he said finally, "your parents loved you enough to want you to survive, to find safety and happiness wherever it might be found. I think they'd be amazed and proud to see how you've not just survived, but thrived. You've honored their memory by becoming someone worthy of the love they gave you." Later, as Grace prepared for bed in the room that had become truly hers, decorated now with her own handiwork, filled with the books she'd learned to love, brightened by the flowers she tended, she took a moment to look at the formal photograph that had been taken after the adoption was finalized. There she stood beside Eli in front of the courthouse, both of them wearing their best clothes and expressions of quiet triumph. But it was the details invisible to the camera that told the real story. The wooden cross hidden beneath her collar, the confidence in her posture that came from knowing she belonged somewhere, the way Eli's hand rested protectively on her shoulder. With the natural gesture of a father proud of his daughter, the girl in that photograph bore little resemblance to the desperate child who'd collapsed at a barn door with the heartbreaking offer to work hard for the chance to survive. That girl had been driven by fear, willing to accept any arrangement that promised basic safety. This young woman moved through the world with the assurance of someone who knew she was valued, protected, and loved unconditionally. As Grace knelt for her evening prayers, her gratitude encompassed the entire journey, the tragedy that had left her orphaned, the suffering that had taught her to recognize genuine kindness, the desperate walk that had brought her to exactly the right door at exactly the right moment. Even Harold Miller's cruelty had played a role in shaping her character, teaching her the difference between exploitation and care, between being used and being cherished. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness that no longer held any terrors, "for showing me that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best things we never imagined possible." In the master bedroom down the hall, Eli Stoltzfus settled into sleep with the profound satisfaction of a man who'd been given an unexpected second chance at fatherhood and had proven worthy of the gift. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to watch Grace continue growing into the remarkable woman she was becoming. But tonight, for the first time in nearly 3 decades, the Stoltzfus house was exactly as it was meant to be, filled with love, laughter, and the quiet confidence that comes from family bonds strong enough to weather any storm. The circle was complete, the lost child was found, and sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the simplest words, "I'm cheap and can work hard, mister." Grace Miller had offered her labor in exchange for survival. Instead, she'd found a father's love, a community's embrace, and the priceless knowledge that she was worth far more than she'd ever dared to dream.